Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here in Vienna, and it's an honor to be one of the first in-person speakers, inaugurating some kind of new normality. I'm going to be speaking to you today about my book that was published this April. It's a project I've been working on for a really long time. For those of you who feel like, somehow you're less productive because you see other people publish every 2 years. I started this project 14 years ago. So it's a project I was doing on the side of other projects for a long time, which is not something I recommend, but it's a project that really had a chance to mature, which has its benefits, because I sat with these materials a really long time and thought about them quite a bit before I came out with this book. Here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to provide you with a little bit of context about Yugoslav migration in Western Europe after the Second World War. I'm going to talk about the research question that drove my interests. I'll talk a bit about my sources, but the majority of the talk is going to be an overview of the book, focusing on some of the key themes and insights that hopefully the book contributes. And I begin with a wonderful illustration by Brigitte, who was a labor migrant. He lived in Germany in the 1970s. He was a typesetter in Frankfurt for a newspaper there. And he was also a writer and an artist who produced copious amounts of illustrations of everyday life of labor migrants in Germany. And I just happened, by some fortune, to be flying out of Zagreb when there was a wonderful exhibit. If you happen to be passing through Zagreb in the next week or so, in Velika Gorica, there's a wonderful exhibit of his artwork that in, Velika Gorica is like a suburb of Zagreb. There's barely anybody there. So it's a really sort of unusual opportunity. Right, so, and why do I bring up this illustration? Simply because it was really important to me to try to capture the voices of migrants and not just tell a top-down story about policies implemented by the state and statistics about who went. But I really wanted to try to get at the experience of being a migrant worker. And hopefully this will come through in my talk. So what is the context here? Well, after the Second World War, specifically in the mid-1960s, Yugoslavia opens its borders to large-scale migration of its workers to Western Europe. And in fact, it is the only, to my knowledge, socialist state in Europe to have a policy of that nature. It was a product of a number of things. It was the product of a sort of a pressure from the bottom that had never gone away, because there was a long history of migration from Yugoslavia to Western Europe, seasonal migration, and long-term migration as well to work in Western Europe from this region, which had not abated with the emergence of the new socialist state. There was also some changes in Yugoslavia's foreign policy orientation, a desire to improve its global image, also a kind of awareness of the increasing pressure on the border and the resources being dedicated to policing the border and the problems caused by illegal border crossers. There was the anticipated reforms, the market reforms that were recognized as likely leading to increased unemployment. And then finally, there was a very kind of practical motivation, a desire to capture worker remittances, remittances which were not just income, they were foreign currency. And Yugoslavia was desperate to acquire more foreign policy because it had a very large trade deficit. Initially, Yugoslavia sort of determined that this policy of allowing workers to leave, this would be temporary migration, right? A sort of a stopgap policy that would no longer be necessary as Yugoslavia's economic development caught up. By 1971, the census estimated that there were roughly 600,000 Yugoslavs living and working in Western Europe. This was an underestimation. Something that I deal with in my book is the problems of collecting information about labor migrants. One of the most important migration scholars of socialist Yugoslavia, Ivo Baučić, wrote a quite in-depth critique of the census, and he estimated that it was missing roughly 150,000 migrant workers who were essentially under the radar or did not fit the categories that were set in the census, and this did not include dependents, so wives, children, etc. Originally, residents of Croatia, ethnic Croats from Bosnia and Herzegovina, were overrepresented in the number of migrants, roughly twice as many migrants as they were a proportion of the Yugoslav population. They were present across Western Europe, but they were concentrated in the Federal Republic of Germany, and the country with the second highest concentration was Austria, actually. They were primarily young men, unskilled or semi-skilled workers from underdeveloped regions. So these are the people that I was interested in. So again, a very large group of people. And I was curious about what this meant in terms of Yugoslavia's relationship with these workers, because again, they were meant to be absent only for a time. So what ties did Yugoslavs continue to have with Yugoslavia? How did Yugoslav authorities justify to themselves and to their citizens this policy of sending their workers to earn a living in Western capitalist societies? And how did it address the negative fallout? And then in turn, so this was sort of the policy focus, but looking from below, how did migrant workers interpret their experiences? And how did they feel towards Yugoslavia after living and working abroad? Here's another one of Drago Trubitaš's wonderful illustrations, many of which depict these scenes of activity that were important for migrants. So you'll see the Baustelle, you'll see the train station, you'll see also the dance club and the bar. You get these snapshots of everyday life for migrant workers. And this was obviously a really quintessential moment when people would be either leaving or arriving on the train, a place of strong emotional kind of resonance for migrants. I'll return to trains in a second. In terms of what my book is trying to do here, it's I have this bad habit of never concentrating on one conversation, but trying to participate in multiple conversations at the same time, which is easier said than done. But I'm hoping I'll contribute to Yugoslav historiography and also to migration studies as a more kind of theoretical field. I'm interested in engaging with this idea of Yugoslav exceptionalism, which has come under increasing attack over the years. At the same time, I think there's something there. There's something interesting about this phenomena that really is limited to Yugoslavia. I'm also interested in thinking about Yugoslavia's global connectedness and its engagement with the rest of the world. This is an interest of mine that I've sort of one of the few threads between my various research projects. My first book was on urban planning in Belgrade after the Second World War, and I was interested in how urban planners borrowed ideas, innovated on those ideas, and implemented them in the Yugoslav context. And here again, I return to this idea of crossing borders, although focusing on a really, not on ideas crossing borders, but on people crossing borders. And I think this is really something that, on the one hand, is interesting about Yugoslavia, this kind of global engagement. And indeed, there are a lot of people working, for example, in the non-aligned movement and various other kinds of cooperations and exchanges. I think it's also representative of a broader turn in the discipline, you know, sort of moving beyond these ideas of Cold War Iron Curtains and recognizing the dynamism, in fact, of exchange, not just in Yugoslavia, but elsewhere. So I don't want to overplay this idea of Yugoslav exceptionalism. Also, a thread running through my research is thinking about the Yugoslav state. And in many ways, I'm always deconstructing it and saying there was no Yugoslav state. There were many different levels of government and administration that were often operating at cross purposes to one another. They were often competing with one another. And in this book, I deal with the federal, the Republican, and the local level. And I show, in fact, how they're doing things that, that might seem at first glance to be coherent, but actually when you look at the details, there are conflicts and tensions that emerge. This becomes particularly clear during the Croatian national revival of the late 1960s. Do you have a cough drop by any chance? It would help me for my throat.
I don't think I have one.
Not a big deal.
Let me just have a look. Perhaps I have one.
Something that one gets out of the habit of giving talks. I used to always have a bag of candy with me, but not anymore. The second literature I'm hoping to contribute to is migration studies, and specifically diaspora engagement, and also labor migration, which in some ways are two distinct conversations, because oftentimes when people think about diaspora, they think of long-term diaspora, as the term was originally meant to describe. But one of the topics that I'm really interested in is this idea that the diaspora just does not exist in nature. It is a construction. In fact, it's a co-construction. So states construct diasporas the way that they categorize all kinds of different population groups. And they construct this category based on the kinds of people they're looking for, the kinds of interests they have. You know, these are all things that enter into that construction on the part of the state. The migrants, in turn, have to also participate in creating this category. They push back. They may not accept all the terms of this relationship. They may seek to expand the boundaries of who is considered diaspora. They use the language that is offered to them in a bid to negotiate what they want from this relationship with the state. So that's something that comes through in my book. And I'm also really interested in this question of territoriality and deterritorialization of the state, and specifically looking at how Yugoslavia governs its citizens across state borders. Although, as I show in my book, I would not say this is deterritorialization, because in governing their citizens abroad, they're constantly referring back to the territory that is Yugoslavia and reinforcing that as a category. Let's see. Yeah, let's leave it at that for now. Very briefly on my sources, you may or may not actually be interested in this sort of historical question, but I drew on a variety of archival documents from the Croatian state archives and the Yugoslav state archives, ranging from committees belonging to government bodies to the Socialist Alliance of Working Peoples, which was an umbrella organization that was charged with mobilizing the population in social, cultural, and other activities, and the League of Communists as well. Presidential Archive. I also looked extensively at published materials, including contemporary studies of migration, film, and newspapers that were targeted at migrants. Okay, and that moves us to the meat of this presentation, which is the structure of the book. The book is divided into two parts. The first, they're not the same size. The first part is sort of two meaty chapters that are all about seeing migrants. Because one of my contentions in this book again, is that this is a category that's constructed. And so I'm interested in the construction of this category. And I focus on two different acts of construction. The first chapter deals with the way in which state bodies themselves define migration. And how this in turn shaped the collection of data, the design of policies, and also the ways in which migrants represented themselves to the authorities, speaking Bolshevik, to use Stephen Kotkin's terminology. And specifically the way in which the state defined migrants as temporary, 2 to 3 years, no family abroad, maintaining primary ties with the homeland. Distinct from the so-called Piselianici, which were the permanent migrants, economic migrants who were judged to be friendly to the Yugoslav state, and also distinct from the political emigration, who were long-term migrants who were considered hostile, actively hostile to Yugoslavia. They were considered to be uneducated, surplus labor. We don't need it for growing the Yugoslav economy. And they were considered to be economic migrants. So again, distinct from political immigrants, fundamentally loyal to Yugoslavia. I also look at migrants, as labor migrants, as a category that was constructed in popular culture. And in order to examine that, I look at film. And I looked at a wide range, I can't remember how many at this point, but in more than 20 films, maybe 25, something like that, documentary and fictional, shorts and feature films, looking at how migrants were portrayed. And what I concluded was that migrants were really portrayed as liminal actors, so sort of between two worlds, and therefore fundamentally dangerous or problematic. They were portrayed as clowns, as agents of corruption, but also as victims. And looking at the victimology of the migrants, there were two different ways in which they could be portrayed as victims. Victims of their own foolishness, their own falling in love with the illusions of material wealth in the West, or victims of failed Yugoslav state policy. These are two ways in which that could be spun. Any which way you look at it, these definitions of migration and of the migrant experience completely annihilated the agency of migrants. They were small players subject to forces that were much bigger than them, and ultimately unable to determine their own future, right? And one of the things I show in the second half of the book is that no matter how sympathetic these portrayals might be, the ones where they're victims of nefarious Yugoslav state policies, this portrayal of migrants as victims would be contradicted by the migrants' own voices, no matter how hard their existence was. They really saw themselves as having control over their lives. So that's the two chapters: seeing migration like a state, the construction of the category, are citizens temporarily employed abroad. And in particular, I have a look at the use of scientific studies in constructing this category, reinforcing this category. I was fortunate enough to find sources, for example, that pertained to like research notes taken as part of doing surveys and interviews with migrants, in which you see the researchers deciding to exclude certain number of respondents on the basis that, oh, this person was clearly hostile to Yugoslavia. They're not a labor migrant, they're a political immigrant, right? So these kinds of acts which get hidden away when the study is published, but that sort of lay bare the ways in which the state was in fact actively constructing this category, and in a kind of vicious feedback loop, reinforcing its own stereotypes, its own misconceptions. But also what this first chapter shows is that at some point in the late 1960s, a feeling of crisis, a feeling of losing control of migrants emerges. The Yugoslav state becomes really concerned that they are becoming alienated, otuđeni. They're becoming lost to the Yugoslav state. And this ultimately drives what is the topic of the second part of my book, which is dramatic increase of investments into various programs that were intended to build a relationship with migrant workers, to cement that relationship and keep the loyalty of those workers. Just a few images to illustrate some of what I'm saying. These are scenes from a documentary short made by Krsto Papić, a Novi Val filmmaker, Specijalni vlakovi, or special trains. It's available online. I highly recommend that you have a look at it. It's a very striking film because it depicts the journey of migrants from Croatia to Germany. This is an example of a film that really depicts migrants as victims of bad Yugoslav policy. Particularly striking are these scenes of German doctors ordering these potential recruits to strip bare and crouch and do various exercises in order to demonstrate their fitness. And I would argue that it draws very much on Holocaust sort of imagery, particularly with these trains and the ways in which at the end of the film, you see them being sort of escorted into this bunker in Munich at the train station, which is where they used to welcome the workers. Also very interesting is the portrayal of this Yugoslav civil servant whose job it is to sort of help with the processing of these workers, and who's portrayed as with all this bling, smoking a pipe, talking about his role in organizing these special trains. So you can see here how and of course there's also interviews with the migrants themselves who are crying and talking about the fact that this decision was driven by the fact that they can't find work at home and would much rather stay home. So that represents one type of depiction. But maybe more common was this depiction here on the left. Migrants, as you've noticed, seem to have a uniform, which is made up of a fedora, some flashy clothing, if possible, a gold watch, and oftentimes a Mercedes vehicle. And in this particular film, Noj, it's a short, you see the migrant going completely crazy. He has a knife and he threatens all these people in the wagon with him. He's drunk. And ultimately it ends in tragedy with him being killed. Ludidani follows a very similar kind of trajectory, a bit less exaggerated, but still this idea of migrants as somehow having lost their bearings and ultimately becoming completely crazy. And then on the right, you see a documentary short with this young man who is talking about having to take care of the family farm because his parents have left. And so you see the sort of the toll that it takes on his family. So these are just some examples of films that built up this idea of the labor migrant. And of course, there's a bit of it's not that the filmmakers themselves necessarily ideate these ideas. They're present in society, they're drawing from them and contributing to them. So it's a bit more complicated. The second half of the book focuses on the cultural and educational policies that Yugoslavia puts into practice in order to try to strengthen a relationship with this group that they perceived was becoming quite brittle because migrants were staying longer. They were laying roots down. They were getting married sometimes. They were bringing their families. They were having children there. Some of them were joining anti-Yugoslav organizations. Some of them were getting involved in terrorist attacks against Yugoslavia. So by the late 1960s, Yugoslavia is really preoccupied and does not want to lose the remittances, is not able to reincorporate these workers into the Yugoslav economy, but would like to improve relationships with them. And in this part of the book, I look at different tools and media that were used, including newspapers that were produced for migrants. I look at a radio program, Našim građanima u svijetu, that was broadcast from Yugoslavia to, well, wherever radio waves go, but aimed at labor migrants. I look also at educational programs for the second generation, mother tongue educational programs. I look at Yugoslav workers clubs or Yugoslav citizens clubs. And I look at also at surveys that were intended to collect information from the migrants. Some of the things that are important in these chapters were, again, the interactions between different levels of government, particularly in the heated climate of the Croatian national revival. And also the importance of the idea of homeland in all these efforts. It was constantly being mobilized, this connection to homeland, except what homeland meant really depended on the particular example that we're looking at, and I'll illustrate some of that to you. Also very important in this part of the book was to try and bring out the voices of migrants who were actually active agents in shaping their relationship to the homeland. And the particular dilemma posed by the second generation. So these were, for the most part, young people who were either born abroad or who had left Yugoslavia before forming any kind of natural attachment to it, who often did not speak the language. And so Yugoslavia is not just trying to reinforce a relationship with them, it's trying to create a relationship with them. How am I doing for time?
We started with a bit of a delay. How much longer do you need?
I don't know, 15 minutes? Is that, that's fine? Okay. Okay. So for example, chapter 4 talks about this radio program, Našim građanima u svijetu. There's a couple of illustrations here. The first one, so this is a radio program that was primarily, it starts in 1963, I believe. You can check my book if I'm notoriously bad for remembering this kind of detail. The format of it is primarily requests for music and playing of music. So people would call in or send, well, actually they would send letters and say, my brother Vinko is in I don't know, Dortmund. I miss him very much. Please play this particular song for him. Okay. And so that was like, I would say probably 3/4 of the program. And there would also be other little bits, interviews with migrants or news from the homeland, but it was primarily a musical program. And it was extraordinarily popular. I can't remember how many thousands of letters this program received, but they've all been, well, I mean, I don't know if they've all been archived, but a large number have been archived in Zagreb at the Croatian State Archive, and you can read them. And they're quite fascinating. One of the things that comes out of reading these letters to the radio program is that listening to the radio was actually a social activity. People would gather together and listen to the program together. And sometimes they would write letters together, making requests. And it was also a program that really created an imagined community between people at home making requests for their family abroad and who were listening in, and people abroad who would also make requests. And so for this one moment, for this half hour or this hour, depending on the time that the program ran, there would be a sense of communing together while listening to this music, maybe having a beer, etc. One of the important figures in this story is Sino Handel, who was the anchor of this program. And here we can see him talking to the mayor of Zagreb, Vyacheslav Holjevac. I don't have a lot of information on this photograph, but it's quite possible that this was actually taken at the time of the Zagreb flood. And what's really interesting is Vyacheslav Hojvac made an online, gosh, what century are we talking about? A radio appeal for assistance from the workers. And so there are a whole bunch of letters from workers sending money back to help the victims of the flooding in Zagreb. And there are also letters from migrants writing into this program saying, please help me. I haven't heard from my parents. They're in the flood zone. Can you help me locate them? So it really shows to what extent the radio program was successful in connecting with these people. And one of the interesting things about the program is that it really tried to depict itself as the people's radio, not as a tool of the Yugoslav state, but as a friend to the people. Now, of course, if you look at the documentation, you see that it was very much serving the interests of the state in terms of consciously trying to carve out what is its mandate, what kind of idea of the Yugoslav was it trying to promote. So, for example, it consciously decided to stay away from ethno-national politics and instead portray a modern idea of what it meant to be Yugoslav, to convey this to the radio program. So it was actually very self-consciously thought out, but it was very successful in achieving this listenership and cultivating this listenership. The next chapter that I look at, or the next medium that I look at in chapter 5 is newspapers. So, and these are sort of chronologically organized, right? That's somewhat the logic here. And I look at the one of the best known newspapers, although not in great depth, which is Vjesnik u Srijedu. But the other newspaper that I look at is a newspaper from a very small region in Croatia, from the Imotska Krajina, which was, you can see it here in black, it's somewhere in there, one of the regions that had the highest percentage of migrants working abroad during this period. And so this was a newspaper that was financed by the Socialist Alliance Working Peoples. And it was specifically aimed at communicating with its citizens living abroad. And again, you have a readership that's local and a readership that's abroad, and it's used to communicate back and forth. One of the things that really interested me about this newspaper is how the idea of homeland here was not the idea of the modern Yugoslav that was being projected in Našem građaninu svijetu. It was a very localized idea of homeland. So this newspaper contains all kinds of anecdote type articles describing traditional life in this region, written in dialect, and speaking to the sort of the harshness of the landscape and the fact that it can't sustain its population, but also the ways in which the old ways were being lost. You know, this older generation continuing to practice the old ways and pining after their sons who are away in Germany, etc. Right? The cartoons in this newspaper are quite interesting. Here is one, for example, which is an old man describing to his son, who clearly, again, is wearing the labor migrant uniform, the Gastarbeiter uniform, telling him about all the work that needs to be done in the fields. And then his son asks, and what's left at the end? And he says, what's left? The only thing that's left is the hope that you will send your children abroad, right? And so this idea that it's a harsh life and ultimately you're left with nothing. This, much like the film that I showed you with the young boy and his, sort of keeping up the farm when in his parents' absence, really speaks to this idea of kind of a failed Yugoslav modernization, in the sense that Yugoslav modernization did not invest in the countryside, right? And so there's a critique there of that. And other cartoons also show an increasing politicization of the issue of labor migration, because what you see happening eventually in this newspaper is this very sort of local idea of homeland, local kind of depiction of the problems of migration, increasingly being bound up with the Croatian national revival, and increasingly also being formulated as a critique of Yugoslav policy. These are a couple of examples of that. You know, what have you, from the Općina, what have you done for our workers in Germany for them to stay? And the answer, well, what are you talking about? We held 127 meetings, right? Or on the right, you know, some well-dressed man entering a bar. He surely works in Germany. No, he works at the bank. So this idea that, you know, there's this sort of parasitic administration that is profiting from the labor migrants, ultimately not facilitating any kind of more sustainable life in Yugoslavia, just enriching themselves. And in fact, in the newspaper, you increasingly see discourse that says, we're tired of sending our money to Belgrade. So this newspaper really illustrates the ways in which a local effort to maintain ties with workers really ends up, on the one hand, representing local interests and local ways of thinking about homeland. And second of all, how ultimately it gets mobilized in ways that were actually in conflict with Yugoslavia's efforts to maintain the loyalty of its workers, right? And finally, the next chapter after that deals with migrant associations, migrant worker associations, which some people have argued, there's so few members in these groups. They're really, this is not an important policy in terms of mobilizing migrant workers. And I say, but that's not really the point. What they were nodes in a kind of network that was used to disseminate and distribute other efforts. So in other words, while the membership of these associations is quite low, they were used to as logistical support for organizing these tours of traveling ensembles from Yugoslavia, like this Zvuci Narodnog Kraja from 1972. Look at the scale of this tour. And of course, it relied on these local associations to organize the venues, to communicate with the broader community, and to bring them in. A lot of people also joined sports clubs. There were huge football associations that were, very bottom-up efforts, right? So Yugoslavia is supervising, it's providing direction, it's giving resources, but ultimately this was really driven by the membership of these organizations. And so, I really want to contest this notion that somehow these were unpopular and unimportant, because they were actually in many cases quite successful in mobilizing Yugoslav workers abroad. Let me just check here. Right, they served as nodes or outposts from which other programs could be disseminated. So they had pioneer clubs for children. They had libraries where you could read newspapers, books, borrow musical, vinyl records. They organized classes. They offered translation services. Some of them. They offered adult education. Some of them. They offered training in the local language. They had folklore sections. And like I said, they assisted with cultural programming. They also had dances, often weekly dances, where people could come and socialize. So they had a much larger reach if you look at the people actually attending those activities. The last two chapters of the book deal with the second generation. The first, chapter 7, I skipped chapter 7. Chapter 7 is really interesting because these are the answers to a survey that was conducted in 1970-71, asking workers through the newspaper and through the radio program to write back and answer the question, under what conditions would you return to Yugoslavia? And what's interesting about this survey is it was open-ended. It wasn't just check the boxes like the previous surveys, and they've kept the responses. And a tremendous number of people answered. I think there's over 1,000 of these responses, again, in the archive in Zagreb. And some people wrote pages and pages and pages, and they dictated their life stories. And what's really interesting about this source is it shows the ways in which this sort of like, this is happening right at the height of the Croatian Spring. It shows the ways in which people were actively following what was going on in Yugoslavia. So they were not alienated in any way. They were definitely paying attention. You can see the discourses that you could read in Vjesniku Srijedu and various other media about the reform program. And you can also see the ways in which they read their own life stories through that, right? So for the continued engagement of these migrant workers in Yugoslavia is not, it's not just that they're repeating what they've heard, they're using it as an interpretive lens to understand the struggles that they faced in their own lives. Not all of them. There are a lot of migrants who wrote responses that were very matter of fact and somehow disengaged from this political contest. But I think it's an interesting, again, problematization of the ways in which migrants have been thought of as being extremely passive. And I want to show the ways in which they are really active in determining the terms of their participation in the Yugoslav project. The last two chapters, building a transnational education system for the second generation. This one is about the amazing project of developing mother tongue education that could be delivered in various European states across very variable conditions in terms of the concentration of the population, the willingness of the host state to contribute financially, the cooperation of the host state in terms of the curriculum that would be offered. It was ambitious from that perspective. It was also ambitious in that education was a Republican level purview, and it required the cooperation of all the republics to agree on a common curriculum that could be offered to children abroad. So that chapter is very focused on that sort of policy side. And in chapter 9, I look at essentially teachers and students and what the experience of being involved in such programs was like. In particular, I focus on the textbook Naša domovina SFRJ, which was again the product in the 1980s when Yugoslavia is unraveling, the product of a collaboration between the different republics to come up with a common curriculum whose purpose was to impart basic language skills and also basic notions of what is Yugoslavia, what is the homeland. And you can see some of the illustrations from this book, the ways in which they were trying to somehow appeal to children who had, for the most part, never even known Yugoslavia, largely through talking about things through the eyes of children. And here you have, for example, a pioneer group marching on some national holiday, celebrating also the 1st of May. The pioneer groups were actively involved in celebrating national holidays abroad. So in crafting the celebrations relating to that. In sort of trying to share with children important sites of memory in Yugoslavia and what they meant and what they told about the national liberation struggle. That was really a central theme of this book. Tito was used very much as a figure through which to reach children. Here we see, I think this one is from I Pinki je video Tito. So talking about a youth who was who's a hero from the Second World War and his encounter with Tito, and also including contributions by migrant children themselves so that they would see themselves reflected in these textbooks. And that, for example, is an illustration from that. again, one theme that runs through the whole book and that really kind of we end with in this last section are these anxieties around, do these people belong to Yugoslavia or have we lost them? There are a lot of studies that come out in the 1980s in particular, trying to assess these migrant children. Do they speak well enough? Do they know enough about Yugoslavia? Do they feel Yugoslav? And very interesting is the fact that it was always seen as a black and white thing, right? And I think this reflects broader understandings of migrants in Europe at the time. Are you assimilated or do you belong over there? And one of the things I try to argue on some scant but suggestive evidence is that it was more complicated than that. Migrant children didn't see themselves as belonging here nor there. And really, I think it's more useful to think about things future oriented, which is to say that one study showed that many of them hoped to continue having engagement with Yugoslavia, and many of them hoped to return or to go to Yugoslavia. And so these attempts to measure their belonging were in some ways, again, returning back to the original themes of the first couple of chapters, they reflected a construction of who these migrants were rather than an understanding of how they saw themselves. So that in a nutshell is the book. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, but maybe I'll end there. I mean, I guess I can end on a sad note, which is to say that just as all these studies were being done, of course, Yugoslavia was beginning to come apart at the seams. And so ultimately, all this effort that was invested into making these young people into Yugoslavs, insofar as it was successful, turned them into citizens of a country that no longer existed. So yeah, I'll end there, and I hope you have some questions for me. Thank you.